Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Some exciting news coming out Tuesday morning for the South Carolina program as quarterback LaNorris Sellers named quarterback one by Shane Beamer heading into 2024. Now, it's exciting news. I wouldn't necessarily call it surprising news. I think a lot of South Carolina fans who follow this program relatively closely in the offseason kind of knew LaNorris Sellers was the guy heading into 2024. But to have it be official, I think is really exciting. I think the most exciting conversation to have regarding LaNorris Sellers is what this kid's ceiling can be heading into 2024, where you go back to LaNorris Sellers coming out of high school. We covered him when he committed to South Carolina as this super traitsy quarterback that obviously is a phenomenal athlete, has a really big arm, but wasn't necessarily the most polished quarterback in that 2023 class. And I think that's why a lot of programs overlooked LaNorris Sellers. Shane Beamer decided, hey, I want to go bet on that really talented quarterback. And from what you're hearing over the last couple of months, LaNorris Sellers is kind of transforming into or from what was a raw, traitsy quarterback to a polished quarterback that can give South Carolina a very high ceiling on the offensive side of the football. Want to get into LaNorris Sellers and talk about what he can bring to this South Carolina offense. And I also want to highlight some other young talent on this South Carolina team that seem to have emerged during fall camp. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about this South Carolina team is you'll get a lot of national media analysts, a lot of college football fans that aren't necessarily plugged in to South Carolina and look and say, they lose Spencer Rattler, they lose a guy like Xavier Legette. Those were kind of their two best football players in the 2023 season. No way they can get better from what you saw in that 2023 year. And I think a lot of South Carolina fans are sitting there and saying, although a lot of people haven't heard of some of these names that are going to be difference makers for South Carolina, we know these kids are really talented heading into 2024. Want to highlight some of those names, a lot of which are freshmen or redshirt freshmen heading into 2024 that, could be difference makers for South Carolina. Before we get into it, and as always, would love to hear how the South Carolina fans are feeling about LaNorris Sellers being that quarterback one. I know from just a pure college football fan perspective, I'm fired up to see this kid in the fall. You talk about talent, you talk about upside. I think LaNorris Sellers has it. So I'd love to hear the South Carolina fans and thoughts and opinions, not only about LaNorris Sellers, but some of the other names that we're going to be talking about. And of course, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The support from the South Carolina fans, it's been amazing. We appreciate you guys, a program that we love talking about. And without further ado, let's get into LaNorris Sellers first. And let's go back to LaNorris Sellers coming out of high school as a kid that only completed 58% of his passes his senior year. But you turn on the film and say, one, the kid has an absolute howitzer attached to his body. I mean, you talk about making any throw on the football field. LaNorris Sellers is kind of that kind of quarterback, but I think what's most fascinating about LaNorris Sellers is he gives you so many different ways that you can attack an opposing defense. We talk about a lot of dynamic quarterbacks, a lot of quarterbacks that can operate with the football in their hands. What we don't talk about a lot is how durable they are. You look at LaNorris Sellers at 6'3", 240, that's a frame, that's a body that you can get involved more in that rushing attack, right? As a Michigan fan myself, J.J. McCarthy, he was an athletic quarterback that could make stuff happen when he had the football in his hands. That being said, Michigan really couldn't tap into that athleticism that much because J.J. McCarthy was 200 pounds soaking wet at 6'3". He was not a guy that you wanted to get tackled more than a couple times a game. LaNorris Sellers, on the other hand, he's a guy at 6'3", 240. He's bigger than most of the linebackers that are going to be trying to tackle him. So he offers you not only that dynamic ability with the football in his hands, but I think more importantly, you can use that athleticism because he's big enough to kind of be a little bit more durable in that rushing attack. And then you look at LaNorris Sellers as a passer. That was, always the thing that we were going to be most in tune with during spring camp, during fall camp was how consistent is he pushing the ball down the field? Is he a guy that can go through his progressions? Is he a guy that can keep the football out of harm's way? We know he has the talent. Now we got to see him kind of put it together, become a polished passer at the quarterback position. Everything you heard coming out of fall camp was, hey, LaNorris Sellers is putting it together. He's not making a lot of mistakes. He's playing within this South Carolina offense. That's what we wanted to see. We kind of knew that heading into fall camp one, LaNorris Sellers was probably going to be the guy. But more importantly, hey, we know he can make those draw-dropping plays What we want to see out of fall camp is him putting it together, taking command of the offense, playing within the offense, and limiting the mistakes. And that's kind of what you heard out of fall camp. And once I started hearing some of those fall camp reports emerging, I just kind of pegged LaNorris Sellers as that starting quarterback. Quite frankly, I had him pegged as that starting quarterback going back to the spring. To make it official, I think that just confirms everything we've heard coming out of fall camp. I know there was kind of an overreaction, if you will, about Robbie Ashford and what he said in front of the media and how that quarterback battle was maybe coming into a controversy. I don't think a lot of South Carolina fans who were in tune with the program kind of thought that way. Now, a couple other names that I just want to talk about in terms of I sit down every morning and kind of read the South Carolina fall camp intel. Darius Jacobs is going to be a redshirt freshman, transferred over from Florida State to South Carolina in the offseason. This kid was fun to watch on the high school film coming out in the 2023 class, was extremely productive in the state of Florida as a high school wide receiver, apparently becoming a guy for South Carolina in that pass catching room, which has been a really big storyline where now I kind of had a hot take a couple weeks ago saying that this South Carolina wide receiver room might be better than it was in 2023, which I think made a lot of people kind of scratch their head saying, hey, you just lost your best wide receiver in Xavier Legette. You had some guys hit the transfer portal. How can you make that argument? The way I would make that argument was you go back to South Carolina in the 2023 season, it was a one-trick pony at the pass catcher spot. If it wasn't Xavier Legette, there were not many difference makers in the wide receiver room. And although you might not have a talent like Xavier Legette heading into 2024, I think it's a much more well-rounded pass catcher room where you have multiple different guys that can create explosive plays in this passing attack versus in 2023, it was really one guy in Xavier Legette. If you could put a safety over top and kind of neutralize Xavier, nobody really was making plays for the South Carolina offense in the 2023 season. Now you have guys like Nick Harbor going into year two. You have some transfer wide receivers who really seem to be difference makers for South Carolina. I wouldn't be surprised if this wide receiver room, although maybe top end, nobody's like Xavier Legette, can be a more effective wide receiver room because you just have more bodies that can create explosive plays. And Darius Jacobs, it's going to be a really fun kid to watch because every time I sat down to read the fall camp intel, his name is getting mentioned. Next guy I want to talk about, and I think another really intriguing fall camp storyline is tight end Michael Smith. This kid's a dude. And I think what is really cool about Michael Smith is he's a pass-catching tight end. He's a difference maker in that passing attack. The big question I think we all have with Mike Smith is, can he get it done from a physicality standpoint as a tight end? Can you block on the perimeter? Can you inline block? That's normally what keeps freshmen off the field. But again, we were looking for difference makers to emerge in this passing attack. It sounds like true freshman Michael Smith is going to be that guy. And again, that's kind of the conversation of why I think so many people are sleeping on the South Carolina team is they don't follow the recruiting trail. They don't necessarily know who Michael Smith is. That being said, South Carolina fans are saying, hey, we got a guy here in Michael Smith who the national media analysts that you listen to on ESPN probably don't know who Michael Smith is. South Carolina fans do. And there's a lot of optimism about this young talent. The other two true freshmen that I would keep an eye on, one, Josiah Thompson. The big difference between Josiah Thompson and a guy like Tree, who started as a freshman last year, Josiah Thompson, one, has been in this program since January. The big question about Josiah Thompson was he going to be physically ready to play in the SEC? Him being there in winter workouts, in spring camp, in summer workouts, and now putting it together in fall camp, you look up and say 6'7", 300 pounds. We have a little less question marks about Josiah Thompson being physically ready to play as a freshman in the SEC. And then you look at Josiah Thompson in terms of the physical traits that God just blessed him with. This kid is a freaky athlete at 6'7". I mean, you talk about footwork. His feet do not get stuck in the grass. He is elite in pass protection, has a ton of length to his game. This kid is a tackle that you were to build into a laboratory. You probably spit out a picture that looks like Josiah Thompson. And now that he's put on that weight, remember, he came into South Carolina probably 6'7", 300 or 265 pounds, maybe 70. He's put on some really, really solid mass. I thought he looked solid in the spring game, but he looks even better in fall camp. I think Josiah Thompson is going to be able to play, and that was the biggest problem for South Carolina last year. Now, I think the South Carolina team was much better than a lot of people thought, but because of the struggles they had on the offensive line, it's hard to win football games when you can't run the football and pass protect. I think the South Carolina offensive line gets better, and if Josiah Thompson can be an upgrade at left tackle, and maybe you can find a different spot for Tree, this offensive line could get a lot better. Last guy we got to talk about, and I think the biggest storyline for South Carolina on defense is the pass rush. I think the South Carolina secondary, and we've talked about this a little bit in the offseason, took a lot of heat because on paper, the South Carolina secondary probably didn't live up to expectations. I'd probably put a lot of the quote-unquote blame, if you will, in terms of the South Carolina pass rush, really just struggled to get any pressure, specifically at that edge rusher position. You had guys like TJ Sanders and Tonka and Alex Huntley on the inside be dudes for South Carolina. That was really the only pass rush production they had. You look at the edge rushers last year, it just wasn't good enough. You're bringing Kyle Kennard. You're bringing a guy, Gilbert Edmond, back from Florida State. Dylan Stewart might be the best edge rusher that we see for South Carolina in the 2024 season. You take a look at the pictures of Dylan Stewart. This kid has transformed his body. Another guy that's been within this program since January. He looks physically ready to get after the passer in the SEC year one. South Carolina was looking for pass rushers in the transfer portal, looking for pass rushers to step up in the 2024 season. I think Dylan Stewart, as a true freshman, could be that guy. The body type he looks like now, in terms of the weight, there's a picture on Twitter, and this kid looks like he can get after the passer as a true freshman in the SEC. A couple big things we wanted to kind of wrap up on. One, LaNorris Sellers. I don't think it's a surprise to many South Carolina fans, but I think it's exciting to make it official. And then look out for some of these young cats on the South Carolina team, whether it's transfer Darius Jacobs, whether it's the true freshman. There's going to be a lot of players that are unknown to a lot of, I'll say, casual college football fans that they're going to be difference makers for the South Carolina team in the 2024 year. We'll cut it there. Going to be a fun team to talk about in the 2024 season. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.